Hi, I'm Dr. Tori Ekstrand. I'm a professor of media law and the First Amendment at the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media. What is free speech? Um, so if you ask that question, obviously, of different people, you're going to get a lot of different answers. If you ask that question of someone here in the United States, they're likely to give you a lot of answers about their ability to say what they want, their ability to protest freely, their ability to publish freely. These are pretty standard ways of answering that question here in the United States. Legally speaking, though, in the US, the right of free expression or the right of free speech is very much tied to what we think of as a negative right here in the United States. In other words, the government has to actually interfere in your speech for you to be able to claim freedom of speech. So freedom of speech is going to be thought of differently, obviously by different people, different cultures, folks of different backgrounds. But here in the US, that kind of very libertarian approach to free speech is essentially what grants us our First Amendment freedoms. It's that sense that the government is not interfering in our expressive activities. That's what the First Amendment protects. That's what free speech is in an American perspective. Of course, this looks a bit different over in Europe. So from a European perspective, obviously there'd be some differences across nations, but generally speaking, if we're thinking about the EU, freedom of speech there too is obviously an important right, but it's thought of more as a positive right and as a freedom that is attached to one's self, as opposed to a freedom that is given to someone by the government, which is how we conceive of it more here in the United States. It is more connected to notions of human dignity and basic human rights. This idea of free expression, that you're actually born with the notion that you need to be able to freely express yourself in order to live a prosperous life. What laws and regulations protect free speech? Of course, that's going to depend on what country you're in, what state you're in, if you're talking about the US. So, of course, the First Amendment protects free expression, free speech here in the United States. But indeed, all 50 states have some version of that protection written into their state constitutions. And of course, the First Amendment was derived from the original constitutions of the 13 colonies. So the First Amendment is very much informed by how it is that the states first conceived of free expression rights, like the state of Virginia and North Carolina each have, for instance, their own versions of their state constitutions that talk about free expression or free speech rights. In Europe, of course, the roots of free expression exist in a lot of different places. They exist, of course, in the various national constitutions of the members of the European Union. They also exist within European governance documents generally. From an international perspective, free speech and free expression is protected, of course, by Article 19, which is part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that protects and promotes free expression and opinion. And so those rights at the UN level are often referred to when we talk about free speech or free expression. So how does social media change or influence our free expression rights? This is also a pretty complicated area. You could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I think for students and citizens in the United States, probably the most important principle to understand is the fact that social media sites are owned by private companies. And because they're all owned by private companies, the First Amendment actually isn't present, believe it or not, on social media sites. In other words, the social media sites are private corporations that get to dictate the terms of speech on every single social media site there is. So most of us who sign into social media sites agree to a terms of service, which say something about how we can conduct and comport ourselves on those social media sites, and that includes our speech. So our speech is actually pretty highly regulated on social media by the corporations themselves. So technically in the US, we do not have free speech automatic free speech rights under the First Amendment in social media spaces. There are now several state legislatures, state governments that have sought to challenge that idea and have tried to argue, indeed, even in front of the Supreme Court, that they have the ability to regulate these platforms, these social media sites, in ways that would inject or require the First Amendment to be a given freedom or negative right on these platforms. So far, the Supreme Court has not decided that question. They haven't really weighed in one way or the other on it. This is a series of cases that's making its way through the system right now. What we do know, though, one case that the Supreme Court heard last year that we do know, to the extent that public officials have social media sites or social media pages on, say, a page like Instagram, if they attempt to block other people on their page, they may actually be violating the First Amendment in that very limited circumstance. But generally speaking, you don't have First Amendment rights on social media. You just don't. Internationally speaking, it's going to vary from country to country what your rights are. There too, you're still signing up for the terms of service of these platforms in various countries, but in countries, particularly in Europe, they more highly regulate, especially US-based platforms in Europe, and they more closely monitor the content moderation practices of social media sites. Say in countries like Germany, where they're very closely looking at, the way people are corresponding with each other or talking to each other on social media sites. And they may fine social media companies for certain speech that may be able to be regulated in countries like Germany. For instance, anti-Semitic speech in Germany is pretty highly regulated on social media platforms, certain types of hate speech. And they're watching much more closely there in countries in Europe than they are necessarily here in the United States, where we tend to allow businesses to do that content moderation practice without, at least at this point, without oversight from the government.